Islamic terror isn't just menacing New York City, of course. It's an even greater problem in Europe, where decades of slow immigration have accelerated to become a wave of migrants that has completely changed the demographic mix of that continent, not to mention the daily lives of the people who live there. Pull up your mental image of Sweden. Pacifism, socialism, blonde people, mandatory politeness, lilting accents, saunas, you know the cliche. If that's what you're picturing, you haven't been there recently. Here's the scene in Malmö, that's the country's third largest city, just the other day. It may look like Karachi or Cairo, but again, that is Sweden. It's changed quite a bit. A generation ago, you would have been hard-pressed to find Swedes marching in support of religiously motivated mass murder. Now, it's all but normal, thanks to mass immigration that has brought tens of thousands of immigrants into that country from North Africa and the Middle East. Malmö has been called Europe's most anti-Semitic city, with dozens of verbal and physical attacks targeting the few hundred Jews who still live there. Just 75 years ago, Sweden was a haven for Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Today, those same Jews fear their own neighbors again, thanks to the Swedish government's decision to bring in a population that hates them. Just 2 days ago, a synagogue in Sweden was firebombed. It wasn't the first such attack, and unfortunately, it will likely not be the last. Meanwhile, in Paris, Muslim immigrants have taken over the city streets in some parts of the capital. Residents of one neighborhood are threatening a hunger strike if camping migrants aren't moved by the end of the year. They say trash is everywhere, and worse, women are being harassed regularly on the street. Mark Stein is an author and columnist who's followed what's happening in Europe for some time, and he joins us tonight. So, Mark, you see videos like that from Sweden, and you realize that this is not the continent that you picture, that it really is completely different because of immigration trends. Are the authorities in Europe, I know you spent a lot of time over there, aware of this? Do they care? Is there a public conversation about this?
Well, Tony Blair was asked by the late Christopher Hitchens about my book and whether the demographic trends in Europe were part of what he called the public conversation, the European conversation with his fellow prime ministers. And Tony Blair gave a very revealing answer, I thought. He said it's part of the subterranean conversation.
Right, exactly.
In other words, Europe's leaders haven't figured out a way to talk about this in public. I know Malmö very well. I've been there once or twice a year for the last 15 years. And the reason I go to Malmö is because it was the first Christian city in what was then Denmark, and it's now going to be the first Muslim city in Sweden. And I do something that I first did at the suggestion of a couple of those Swedish blondes you were mentioning, the ABBA girls, Britt Ekland, those kind of girls that you were talking about earlier, that they made one evening to me as I was sitting in a coffee shop. And at twilight, I walked from downtown Malmö to Rosengård, which is the big Muslim suburb. And the Swedish blondes thin out, and the covered women and the bearded men come towards you, until eventually you're in a part of Sweden in which there are no uncovered women, and in which Muslim women who've come from Muslim countries where they didn't have to go covered, such as Bosnia, suddenly find they have to go covered when they emigrate to Sweden. That walk, as the blondes thin out and the big bearded men come towards you in ever greater numbers, that is Europe's future walking towards you. And I would say it's the biggest story of our time.
Yes.
That Christendom is being transformed at an extraordinary level, to the point where Swedes will be an ethnic minority in their own country by mid-century. But
what I don't understand, why is no one allowed to talk about it? I mean, if Swedes or Danes or Finns were flooding into Jordan and displacing the native population and forcing people to follow their Christian practices and obey their cultural imperatives, their mores, I think liberals here would say, well, no, you can't do that. It's their country. Right. Why is it different when it happens in Europe or the United States?
Well, you actually see it in the United States when they talk about New Orleans no longer being a chocolate city because too many white people have moved in. If you remember, that was one of the headlines a few years ago.
Yeah.
And I think that the problem, of course, is that the minute you raise it, you get accused of being racist. The minute you talk about it with any degree of honesty, that deputy leader of Britain First that you mentioned a couple of days ago, the police in Belfast flew all the way to London to arrest her, put her on a plane, take her back to Belfast for something she said in a speech at Belfast City Hall. Swedes are particularly dishonest about it. The wealthy Swedes, the minute their area gets like those scenes you were showing in Paris, where there's too many migrants and the neighborhood starts to change, they move out to all-white suburbs and all-white villages, and the moment they're there, they vote ever more enthusiastically in polls about how wonderful multiculturalism is. In other words, the more they move away from it, the more they are in favor of it.
Of course, because it doesn't affect them. But if you intentionally set out to create an environment in which violent nationalism would flower, wouldn't this be it?
Absolutely. I mean, the first duty of the political class is prudence. And you don't extinguish prudence for utopian delusions. And the reality is that people, as people know in almost any part of the world, that the minute you have Islam as 15 to 20% of your population, the mediation of relations between Islam and the rest of society becomes your principal domestic consideration, as is happening in front of our eyes in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, in the United Kingdom.
And it will happen here. The first duty of the political class is prudence. I'm getting that tattoo, and I'm giving you credit when I get it. Mark Stein, it's great to see you.
That's a great tramp stab to get. I recommend that, Tucker.
It's true. Thank you.
Muslim countries, perhaps no nation on earth is more committed to accepting foreign migrants and refugees than Sweden. 2016 alone, the country accepted more than 160,000 asylum seekers, despite having a population of less than 10 million people. Only 500 of these migrants were able to get jobs in Sweden. But if these arrivals aren't able to work, they're at least able to commit crimes, quite a few of them, in fact. Ami Horowitz is a filmmaker. He went to Sweden to chronicle its refugee experience. Here's a short clip of what he found.
Do you see the violence really spreading across Sweden into the cities?
At least 1 or 2 times a week.
And let's say 5 years ago, how often would you say it was?
No,
3 times a year.
Really? The increase in this kind of crime is exponential.
I think we caught off guard. We didn't expect it to be so much increase.
Tucker spoke with the filmmaker earlier this week.
Ami, thanks a lot for coming on. So before you describe what you saw there, give us the overview. What is the justification within Sweden for importing this many migrants from other countries? Why are they doing it?
Well, in Sweden's own words, they consider themselves to be a humanitarian superpower, probably the only superpower that they would qualify for. So they feel that's their moral duty to open their borders to all and any refugees that want to come to them.
So you've recently spent time there. Tell me if I'm overstating this. I don't think many people in Sweden think this is working well. Is that fair to say?
No, it's not fair to say, actually. In fact, most people that you ask about the refugee crisis, they will say, because the reason why I did the whole thing to begin with, taking a step back, was that there was an absolute surge in both gun violence and rape in Sweden once they began this open door policy. So they know that this crime is happening. They can feel it. The statistics are clear. But they would refer to what is the root cause behind it and say, oh, it's just more, it happened to be more violence. It's men who are raping people, not the refugees. They'll make excuses for it. The majority of the population in Sweden still want to have an open door policy. It's confounding.
Huh, that's remarkable. Now, the statistics on the crime rise that you just referred to, there have been reports in the American press that those statistics are either closely held by the Swedish authorities or they've been manipulated by the Swedish authorities to downplay the role of migrants. in those crimes. Is that true?
Well, it depends. The crime statistics are the crime statistics, and they're not closely held. They're open to the public, and they do show this incredible surge of violence. What may actually be the problem is that they oftentimes try to cover up some of these crimes. That, for example, there's been a rash of these rapes, these music festivals, and what happens is they cover up as far as they could who the perpetrators were, or if actually rapes had actually occurred. Now, obviously, when you have so many people witnessing these rapes, they're difficult to do, and they've come out to the public. But I think that's kind of what they're referring to, that the government has gone out of its way to try to cover up some of these problems.
That is grotesque. So to the job numbers, we had in the intro something like 160,000 asylum seekers, only 500 wound up working in Sweden. That leaves a lot of unemployed people. What are they doing and how are they living?
Oh, they live great, Tucker. I mean, it's one of the most generous, financial programs that they have in terms of the amount of money they're giving to them, the housing benefits they get, the education benefits they get, the cash benefits they get. So they have these, and what they really become are no-go zones. These are areas that cops won't even enter because it's too dangerous for them. This is the policy of the National Police Authority in Sweden. So they live in these enclaves, which, by the way, are lovely. They're leafy neighborhoods. They're beautiful apartments. And they are sitting around. You're right. It's difficult to get jobs. There's too many of them. But they have tremendous benefits there, which is why so many of these migrants are going to Sweden to begin with.
Now, we know that the masochism of the West really knows no bounds at all. So I believe you when you say that it's not often people say out loud, I'm dissatisfied with this arrangement. I know Swedes, though, who at least in private will say this is a disaster. What's the social sanction for saying that out loud? Can you just say, this isn't working, or do people come down on you for saying something like that?
Oh, you can say it, but you're a racist. You're a xenophobe, right? You're an Islamophobe. When I was out there, I remember I was at this kind of swanky party in Stockholm, and I started discussing what I was doing there, and the entire party kind of gathered around me and started yelling at me that all those things. I'm a xenophobe. I'm a racist. I'm anti-Islamic. Even though the statistics were clear about who's the perpetrators, it doesn't make a difference. It's very socially unacceptable to make these kind of claims.
Right, because the most important thing is to feel virtuous, I guess. Ami Horowitz, that's amazing. One last question. I can't resist. What's the long game here? How is this going to look 10 or 15 years from now? Does it seem like assimilation is taking place?
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, we don't have to actually prognosticate on what the long game is. You can look at France and Belgium, because they've been doing it for that period of time, for longer. And you can see the social unrest that's going on there, the terrorism that's happening there. Sweden, this is a relatively new policy, phenomenon for them. And by the way, Sweden had its first terrorist Islamic attack not that long ago. So they're now getting the taste of what we've been seeing across Europe already.
Sad. Thanks a lot for joining us. Ami Horowitz.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it. President Trump described the supposedly dreadful immigrant situation in Sweden. Journalists at every media outlet from here to Malmö have been debating how bad things really are there. They're fine, say a lot of them. Well, Katie Hopkins works as global columnist for the Daily Mail. Rather than going on Wikipedia or reading some Vox article to learn what to think, as most do, she decided to actually go to the country. She went to Rinkeby in Sweden, in the immigrant-dominated suburb of Stockholm that was torched by rioters last week. What did she find? Katie Hopkins joins us now. Katie, thanks for coming on. First of all, good for you for actually going. You always learn a lot when you get on a plane and go to the site. What did you expect to find, and how did it differ from what you found?
I expected to find what a lot of people have been saying. It's like, there's nothing wrong. Sweden's beautiful. I live here. I see none of this. I expected to see the Sweden I imagine from maybe Christmas cards or whatever. But, when I got there, it's a very different story. Within 10 hours of landing, an asylum centre was burnt down, arson suspected. There was a hand grenade planted in a bin. And when I rushed there to find out what had gone on, I was told, well, why politicise this? Journalists are blamed, Why make this a political thing? Why can't it just be a hand grenade in a bin outside a police station and a mosque? And I kind of felt like, oh, who's the mad one here, me or you? And then speaking to the women in particular, there's a much quieter story that's not being told, which is that women are frightened to go out. When I went to Rinkeby in the evening, I was the only female, certainly the only white female. And when I spoke to the ladies, it's because they're terrified of the crime. They're terrified of the gangs. And one particular lady I spoke to, she runs home at night because she's fearful of all the men that gather at night under the bridge where she lives. So they're kept indoors. So it's a really frightening place for a lot of women there, particularly.
Well, the irony, of course, is that Sweden is the original feminist success story, and its own government describes it that way, as the first truly feminist country. And yet you're saying that Swedish women are afraid to go outside?
Absolutely, and that was exactly the point that made me kind of mad, you know. I was saying to them, but Sweden's always been the aspiration. You guys have the best maternity leave, the best paternity leave. You're seen as the epitome of a society that's truly evolved. And the funny thing was, after I put up my first article for Mail Online, a lady, a stranger, came over to me in a cafe and she said, you've got to keep going. You've got to keep speaking out on behalf of these women because they have been silenced. And funnily enough, or curiously enough, the lady, let's call her Lucy, that is too scared to go out of her apartment that was broken into last week and she had her car torched, she said she was frightened to have her picture taken because of the feminists. Because if she spoke out, she would be labelled a racist and they would hunt her down. So the feminists are now working against the women of Sweden, and they call them the extremists now. Feminists are the new extremists in Sweden, and they are part of the problem, part of the mafia that are silencing the problem that Trump, thankfully, spoke out about.
Yeah, it's not so different here. I mean, our media, as you know, worked feverishly to downplay any reports there might be a problem in Sweden. They're dishonest and politically motivated, so that wasn't surprising. What is surprising is how many Swedes are apparently afraid to say what they really think about what's happening there. Why is that?
Absolutely. There's this absolute belief, 80 years of liberal politicians, there's an absolute belief that Sweden is utopia, and that's the only message you can send. There's absolutely mandatory belief in multiculturalism. Eritrea, Somalia, Afghanistan, they don't just arrive in Sweden and then miraculously, you know, join the multicultural dream. No, they bring every war, every fight, every hostility with them. And there in Rinkeby, in Sweden, you have the Eritreans who hate the Somalians, who hate the Afghanis, and that's just brought with them. And we have the same in Calais. When I went to Calais to address the migrant situation, they're exactly the same. The Somalians don't speak to the Eritreans, who don't speak to the Afghanis. And absolutely, Sweden won't acknowledge that. They won't acknowledge they've got a problem, because that would mean admitting that everything they've believed in, multicultural ideas, are wrong, and that they shouldn't have let in 200,000 people in 2 years, and they're about to let in